I'm delighted to be welcoming you to the inaugural Tanner Lecture on Ethics, Citizenship, and Public Responsibility. I'm Grant Reher, Director of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute. Campbell is the principal organizer of the Tanner Lecture Series for the Maxwell School. And we're excited and honored to have former Senator Bill Bradley as our inaugural speaker. Dean Steinberg will have more to say about the senator in a moment. I want to tell you just a little bit about the new series and its sponsor, Dr. Lynn Tanner, a Maxwell PhD, and CEO and chairman of Tech Canada. What strikes me most about Lynn's life and career, as well as this lecture series, is the joining of theory and practice and the challenge to commonly held distinctions between the public and private sectors, in particular, the ethical norms and civic responsibilities located there. The series aims to ask some pretty big questions and to push our thinking on them. What does it mean to be an ethical citizen? What do the needs for public responsibility demand from us in either the public or the private sector and across different levels of organizational authority? Lynn has been keen to explore these questions and to try to answer them through the notion of what he calls generative activity. Activities that create, produce, and most importantly, enrich our private and public lives. And the series seeks to do the same by bringing in leaders who have wrestled with these questions and produced in their fields and who can challenge our students and the broader community to do better, to borrow the senator's book title, and to really take themselves seriously, to borrow something that Lynn said earlier today to a smaller group of our students. We're grateful to Lynn for his vision and for his generosity. And I also want to thank Bethany Wallowender and Kelly Coleman and the Campbell Institute for their hard work in putting together this event. And especially, I want to thank our dean, Jim Steinberg. Jim is a relatively recent Maxwell addition. I think, as most of you know, he has come to us from the State Department, where he was deputy secretary. His prior posts include dean of the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin and deputy national security advisor to President Clinton. Jim has been instrumental in our thinking and our planning for this lecture. And so let me turn it over to him now. Jim?
Thanks, Grant, and to all of you, thank you for coming. To Lynn Tanner for this terrific inspiration, which is so close to everything that we care so much about here at the Maxwell School, to all the people who helped put this together, and to our two distinguished guests who are here to be the inaugural Tanner Lectures. And for me, it's a great personal honor and privilege to be able to introduce Senator Bill Bradley as our inaugural Tanner Lecturer. It's commonplace in these things to say that a speaker needs no introduction, but this is surely as clear a case as one can possibly imagine. Rhodes Scholar, three-term U.S. Senator, candidate for president in the 2000 Democratic primaries, writer, public advocate, radio host, and of course I have to mention it here at Syracuse University, all-time great basketball player. I had the personal privilege of having the chance to observe Senator Bradley up close during the 5 years that I served as a staff member of the United States Senate in the early 1980s. And I can tell you I worked with a lot of great people, including the senator that I worked for, Senator Edward Kennedy. But there was no member of that distinguished body who cared more, worked harder, was more committed and more creative in doing the people's business than Senator Bradley. And the best test of that was not only his enormous accomplishments during his time as senator, but also the extraordinary staff that he assembled, which to my mind is a real test of what a great leader is all about. As you know, Senator Bradley has recently completed a new and timely book called We Can Do Better. It's an especially fitting topic for us here at Maxwell for at least two reasons. First, after all, this is the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, and our partnership with Lynn Tanner is committed to strengthening that sense of public responsibility and integrity that has been characteristic of Senator Bradley's entire public life. Second, if you look out front of our building, out that way, you'll see a statue of Abraham Lincoln, whose December 1862 State of the Union message was the inspiration for the title of the senator's new book. Now, as our historians here will know, this message of President Lincoln's, was one of his most eloquent statements of his presidency, in which he famously observed, and I quote, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country." It's hard to imagine a challenge more fitting to our time, nor a speaker so well qualified to make it. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Senator Bill Bradley.
Microphone on? Great. Thank you very much, Jim, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's particularly a pleasure to be the first Tanner lecturer. I think that the Tanners demonstrate by their generosity to this program how important it is to care about a university and to care about the kind of things that are brought to this university. I feel honored that I can be their first lecturer. So thank you very much for your life and for all of your work and the difference you've made in the lives of millions of people. Well, where shall I begin? This is not a formal lecture, all right? This is not where get your notepad out and take the notes down. So maybe I ought to begin by telling you a story. I used to make my living running around in drafty arenas wearing short pants. And so maybe, we didn't have the dome exactly, but we did all right. And, oh, by the way, hey, hi, I saw Bruce Springsteen last night at the Garden. And he did that to me a number of times. He pointed right to me and said, "Hey, how are you?" He knew me, right? Anyway, I played with the New York Knicks, and it was about my third or fourth year, and we played the Boston Celtics back-to-back, Saturday night and Sunday afternoon. And we lost both games to the Celtics. And the following week, I got a letter from a fan. And the letter said, "Bradley, if you lose one more game to the Boston Celtics, I'm going to come to your house and kill your dog." And the guy signed his name. Joe Pell. I don't know, maybe because he signed his name. I wrote back to him. I said, "Dear Joe Pell, look, we don't like to lose any more than you do. We're doing the best we can. And by the way, I don't own a dog." Well, you can guess what happened. About 3 weeks later, a UPS truck pulled up in front of our house, and the guy gets out of the UPS truck. He's carrying a big box. He puts the box down on our front steps, and my daughter looks at me and says, "Dad, what is this box out there with a dog in it?" And I look outside, there's the box. On the outside of the box is an envelope. On the outside of the envelope, it says, "From Joe Pell." And I open an envelope, there's a note inside. The note says, "Bradley, don't get too attached to this dog." Which I always thought was pretty good advice for a politician. Don't get too attached to your job because the people might have another thought. People ask me what do I miss about not being actively involved in politics these days, and I really miss two things. One is I miss not doing public policy 24 hours a day. This is a great school of public policy. People who are here, who are professors, and certainly those students are privileged in a very fundamental way, and I think because of that reputation, you were able to attract Jim to come. But I miss that, and I try to fill that void by writing books like We Can All Do Better, which will be at your bookstore in about 3 weeks. And then I miss the people, quite frankly. I miss their hopes, their fears, their dreams. I miss sharing that. And I try to fill that void by a radio program I have on Sirius XM satellite radio called American Voices, in which I interview people all over the country about their lives. And the interviews usually fall into two categories. One is I interview somebody who has an unusual job. So you hear about the dignity of work and what work means to people's lives, and everything from a groundskeeper at Fenway Park to a public health nurse in the Aleutian Islands. And I also interview somebody who's doing something special in their communities across the country. For example, I interviewed a guy who had shined shoes in the Pittsburgh Children's Hospital for 46 years. And out of every tip he received, he put a part of that into a fund to pay for poor kids' health care. And the day I interviewed him, he'd put over $100,000 into that fund. When I ran for president, I used to talk about the goodness of the American people, and that's what I meant, the shoeshine guy at the Pittsburgh Children's Hospital. And the reality is that there are communities across this country where that is a real fact, and there are millions of people. I did this show, I've done over 400, so I did about 30 or 40, and the people at Sirius came to me and said, what are you going to do when you run out of finding people like this? I said, I'm never going to run out of people. I will always find them because that's what America's all about. So if we know that, we have to look at our politics today, and we say, why doesn't our politics reflect that all the time? And I think one of the reasons is that there's way too much money in politics today. That's the reality. I mean, when I ran for public office the first time in 1978 in New Jersey, I spent $1.65 million on my primary and general election combined. In 2000, the person that replaced me spent $63 million, 61 of which was his own. And so it's no mystery then why 37% of the Congress and Senate are millionaires as opposed to 9% of the total population. Now, how did that happen? And here we are in a presidential election where we have individuals giving $15 million. The guy that kept Gingrich in the race gave $15 million to his campaign. How did that happen? Well, you know, these things don't occur in a vacuum. And in this case, they occurred because of two Supreme Court rulings. 1972, Richard Nixon campaign, Watergate, raising money, cash in a bag, a lot of scandal, law passed limiting the amount of money that somebody can spend in a campaign. Taken to the Supreme Court, 1976, Buckley-Valeo decision says you cannot limit the amount someone can spend in his own or her own campaign because to do so limits free speech. And so the result is that you have the guy spending $63 million to get elected to the Senate in New Jersey. And you have 37% of the Congress who are millionaires. And so, I mean, that is one historical moment. The other historical moment, of course, happened in 2010. But before we get to 2010, let's go back in time. It's 1896. William McKinley's running. He has a great campaign manager. Campaign manager is Mark Hanna. Mark Hanna is the first major, shall I say, mover and shaker, cutting deals as a campaign manager. McKinley wins. 1900, decided, well, I got to try to improve my image. He selects a young New York politician named Teddy Roosevelt as his vice presidential candidate. Teddy Roosevelt comes out of the progressive Republican tradition of New York State. And he is appalled by what he sees in the campaign. Because Mark Hanna goes to corporation after corporation and says, I want $3 million from you, I want $2 million from you. Why? They say, because we're going to pass laws to earn much more than that for you. And Teddy Roosevelt's appalled when he sees this. Well, as luck would have it, or tragedy, McKinley's assassinated, Teddy Roosevelt assumes the presidency. And in 1907, in his first full term, he passes a law, the Tillman Act, which says corporations may not contribute to political campaigns. And the result of that is, of course, corporations were prohibited. That was the law of the land until 2010. In 2010, the Supreme Court of the United States and Citizens United determined the following. You cannot prevent a corporation from spending any amount of money it wants to spend on a political campaign, because to do so would be to limit the corporation's right to free speech. Buckley-Vallejo limit the individual's right to free speech. Why is that relevant? Because in 1886, in Santa Clara versus Southern Pacific Railroad, the Supreme Court determined that corporations were people. It was a lawsuit brought on due process grounds, and the Supreme Court, which is the robber baron court, said that a corporation is a person, and therefore you cannot limit a corporation's right to free speech. Now, the absurdity of this position should be obvious to everyone. I mean, I will believe a corporation is a person when a corporation gets married, right? Or better yet, goes to jail. And so the reality is that those are the two decisions that have created our current political climate where money has such a dominant role in the process. And so you look out there and you say, well, is there anything we can do about it as a citizen? And there is an answer to this, like with everything. You know, today, I mean, one of the reasons I wrote this book is to give people hope about the future. To say, look, we've confronted problems before in this country, and we've overcome the problems. We've settled the continents. We've fought wars. We've dealt with the legacy of slavery. We've moved ourselves forward in many countless ways, and we can do it here again. But the people have to have a belief that our democratic process gives us the means to change direction in our country and to alter the role money plays in our lives. If you don't believe that, it's never going to happen. And in the internet age, as I said to a class earlier, apathy is not an option. So what can we do about it? Well, before I get to that, let me give you an example. This is a little bit abstract about the role of money in politics. Let me describe the financial industry in the United States, the role of money, and what's happened in the last decade. You know, we had a little problem in 08, 09, right? The world financial system almost crashed. Now, why did the world financial system almost crash? Devastating the lives of millions of people, their pension funds, jobs, their hope for the future. I really think that the problem rests with 5 public policy mistakes that were made. I mean, greed, yes, certainly greed, but greed's part of the capitalist system, right? But you have to channel the greed, otherwise you have disaster. And because of 5 public policy mistakes, we had a disaster. What are they? First one, the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Law. Now, what is the Glass-Steagall Law? Well, as we know in capitalism, things are run in cycles. The 1920s was a time of great speculation where banks took other people's money and took big risks and lost a lot of people's money, and a lot of the banks of America closed. The Congress looked at this and said, we want to separate a bank that collects money from depositors from a bank that makes risky investments. And so we'll create a commercial bank which takes deposits and has those deposits insured by the federal government. No more bank failures there. And then we'll have investment banks, which will be banks that will invest their own money, and each partner having joint and several liability, which means rather cautious investments. And that was the system. And if you were a good investment banker, you made good investments, you take some risk, but not too much risk. If you were a good commercial banker, you were kind of the core of your community, making loans for home building, for car purchases, for seed, et cetera, et cetera. That worked very well. And it worked well for a long time until the banks started to say, well, we need more power. We'd like to merge these two. And in 1999, the Glass-Steagall Law was repealed. And as a result, the 10 largest financial institutions in the United States went from having 10% of the financial assets in 1990 to having 75% of the assets in 2010. So I do not think you can separate the fact, this repeal, from what happened, because now banks could draw money in from depositors and take big risks. That's the first mistake. Second mistake, there is something called derivatives. Derivatives are the following. I will describe this as a daisy chain so you will get a sense. You get a mortgage to a house. Bank puts together 1,000 mortgages and sells them to another financial institution as a mortgage-backed security. The bank no longer has any responsibility for whether the loan is repaid or whether it's a good loan. And then the second financial institution takes those 1,000 mortgage-backed securities and puts them into a collateral debt obligation. And the collateral debt obligation is then sold to another financial institution that then, and this is how bad it got, put 1,000 collateral debt obligations into a CDO squared and sold it to another financial institution. And of course, when the music stopped, everything collapsed. How did that happen? Because in 1999, the Congress prohibited, specifically in law prohibited, any regulation of derivatives. So greed unchecked leads to disaster. Third mistake was that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which were two quasi-government institutions that were established to buy loans, buy mortgages from banks, in so doing lower the cost of making a mortgage and make it more available to other people. Well, you know, if you're a president and you want to have a lot of people have homes, you can do one of two things. You can subsidize it directly, you can give them a tax benefit or whatever, but you have to spend money to do that. But in the early 90s, it became the idea, well, you can have it by simply encouraging Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to loosen up their standards and make loans to individuals who otherwise wouldn't meet the criteria, and the result is more people will own homes in America. Right, until the music stops. Now, the fourth mistake is in 2003, not happy with this consolidation of economic power or non-regulation of derivatives, banks came to the SEC and asked to increase the leverage they had, which it was 10 times their capital to 30 times their capital, which is what they did. And the result was, of course, that when the crash occurred, everything kind of fell down, crashed all around it. That was the fourth mistake. The fifth mistake is the Federal Reserve itself during this period didn't follow the advice of the Federal Reserve Chairman in the 1950s, William Chesley Morton, who said that his role as the Chairman of the Federal Reserve is to remove the punch from the party. Instead, we fed it with almost zero interest rates. Now, those are 5 public policy mistakes that produced the crisis of 2008, 2009. Now, what's the point of me giving you this history? To draw the connection that in 2009, 2010, the financial industry contributed $318 million to politicians in Washington. From 1998 to 2010, the financial industry contributed $2 billion. $2 billion in contributions in lobbying in Washington. And so Fannie Mae, in that period, contributed $100 million, one institution. And so you look at this and you say, look, we're never going to be able to deal with our problems in this country. You try to get deficit reduction. You try to do, you're blocked by this interest group or that interest group. There's an economist named Mansur Olson that I always admired. He passed away. He was at the University of Maryland. He used to say, you can, in a democracy, reach a point where the narrow interest immobilizes the process so it's incapable of doing what it must do to serve all the people. And I think that's where we are in this process. That's where we are. Now, so I would argue that the answer to this is pretty simple. And whenever problems have occurred in American democracy, there are always answers. And the answer to problems of democracy is more democracy. And just as in the late 19th century, US senators were selected by state legislatures and House members by the House, by people. Well, state legislatures were sending people that were hospitable to the interests, the railroad largely, and banking then. And the result was that the work of the people wasn't getting done. There started a movement that says we need a constitutional amendment that provides for direct election of senators, just like there is direct election of House members. They no longer have to be selected through corrupt state legislatures. And I think that that's what happened. So in our current circumstance, here's what I think is the remedy. You need to have a constitutional amendment that undoes Buckley-Vallejo and Citizens United, that says specifically that the federal, state, and local government may limit the amount of money spent in a political campaign. Very simple. And then whatever that number is set by the Congress, say for running for Senate in New York State, public money will be appropriated for those campaigns. Once you do that, you take all of the special interest money, the $2 billion from the financial industry, the $318 million in 2009, the $145 million from the healthcare industry to assure that they didn't have a public option in the healthcare bill, $75 million from the energy industry to assure you there was no energy bill. They're all gone. Those two reforms. Now, in the last, I'm going to wind up here because Jim wants to have another dialogue and some questions and get you involved. But in the last year, citizen involvement has taken two forms. One form was the Tea Party, right? The Tea Party had one objective, and that was one substantive objective. That was roll back government. And indeed, in 2010, it elected 43 members of the House of Representatives. Those 43 members, when John Boehner, the Speaker, and Barack Obama, the President, cut a deal for a $4 trillion deficit reduction package on a weekend, Boehner went back to his caucus and presented this to them, and the 43 Republicans said they wouldn't support it, and they killed it. And in the process, almost brought this great nation to the brink of bankruptcy. That's how fast things can change. People say things don't change in politics. The change of a small group of people, well organized, almost bankrupt the country. A second citizen involvement in this period was Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street had a very catchy slogan: we're the 99%, 1% of the wealthy, and we're the 99%. But no specific program, no agenda. In fact, some argued we shouldn't have an agenda, we should just point out inequality. And The result was they've had no impact on the political process. So I say, rather than an passionate movement with no objective, have a very specific objective like getting money out of politics and attract passion to it. And that then the only way that's going to happen is with citizen involvement. The only way that's going to happen is people in this room decide that their future is as much in jeopardy because of the role of money in politics that they're prepared to step up and make a difference in the life of their country. And to me, it's a major opportunity for every student in this school and for every citizen. And you know, if you don't do it, you're abdicating your responsibility. Now, you don't have to do this particular thing, but citizen involvement is absolutely critical to the functioning of a democracy. And if all you do is sit home at night and watch Fox with the yada back and forth, or CNN, or MSNBC, and you treat politics like a spectator sport. No, politics is not a spectator sport, and it's certainly not a vicarious experience. If you don't take the effort, and as I said earlier, in the internet age, apathy is not an answer, is not an excuse. Then what can happen is that once again we can get control of our government, and our government can address the real problems people face in this country, and we can move on into the 21st century with the confidence that we can be in the 21st century what we were even more than we were in the 20th century. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Bill. And as you can imagine, for this audience and this crowd, it's an incredibly important message, and one which I think many people here believe very passionately in. But I think we might begin the conversation by sort of exploring why this turns out to be such a hard challenge. We've reached the point now, if you look at the public discourse, the campaign debate, in which government is almost defined as equivalent to the problem, not the solution. You have candidates who make their principal claim to public support that they are far from Washington, that they're not in government, that they don't have anything to do with it. And it's not just among Republicans, right? You have, even going back to President Clinton, the era of big government is over. We were talking earlier today with Betty Sue about how almost unimaginable to talk about a great society it is now with the government in the forefront. How did we get to the point where government is seen as the problem? Are there problems with government that we need to address? And how important is it to restore a kind of more positive, constructive view about the role, not just of the federal government, obviously, but at all levels?
Well, the kind of knee-jerk response is to ask you the question, would you rather spend your own money or would you rather have government spend your money? But let's pause on that a minute. What would we be without government, right? What would we be? I mean, everything from sewers to roads to the Federal Drug Administration to the Federal Aviation Administration to the FBI to the CIA to the Weather Bureau to monitoring earthquakes. I mean, that's government. So the people that say there shouldn't be government, I look at them and say, they're detached from reality. No Social Security, no Medicare. What are they talking about? So I think that the only way that you counter the drift is to be very direct about what government provides for people and how it is the best collective expression of what the people desire, which is what democracy is supposed to be. At the same time, government is not without its own shortcomings. And therefore, in addition to campaign finance reform, you have to, people say government reorganization. That's always sometimes an excuse for not doing something. You just reorganize the boxes. There has to be greater accountability. I think sometimes the public employee unions have too much control over the process. I think sometimes that computer systems at the federal level are archaic, to say the least. Look at 9/11. The FBI and the CIA didn't communicate with each other. They had different computer systems. And so there are plenty of things we need to do to revitalize government for the 21st century, but let's not be under the illusion that we don't need government. I mean, the first progressive was Abraham Lincoln. He was the first person who said, we need government to do for all of us what each of us can't do for ourselves. And what did he do then? Well, he created the Homestead Act, which said if you head west and you get land, you get 600 acres of land on your own. The government will give it to you. He financed the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. He financed the construction of land-grant colleges all across the Midwest and the West. So the idea that there is no government, so you have to confront that, and you have to be very direct in confronting it. And then you have to admit that there are certain things that have to change and that you have to be willing to spend the money to do it. Why doesn't the information systems of the federal government change? Because it would cost money. Nobody wants to put a price on it. But without that, we're going to be left in this environment of two forces. One being defensive about government, trying to appear like they doesn't really want government, and the other one being hostile to government, trying to eliminate government. Neither one of those is going to solve the longer-term problems that the country have to face.
You know, one of the arguments that gets made on the broader level that tries to get around the specific virtues.
Do you care if I take my coat off in
Please.
here? Come to Syracuse and you're hot?
We don't do air conditioning in Syracuse. You know, when people get into these arguments, they say, yeah, all these programs are good, but the problem is that because of the great drains that government puts on the economy, it hurts our competitiveness, that what we really need to do is focus on sustaining growth, and that means we need to have fewer revenues, fewer taxes. That needs to be the strategy for the future. What's your response to that in terms of the impact of government on competitiveness, on the ability
I mean, as I alluded to, I think government provides the basis for economic growth. What if we don't? You want to have private roads? What about, you want to fly in airplanes where there's no Federal Aviation Administration or air traffic controllers? I mean, do you want to wake up in the morning and not be able to get the weather? I mean, the reality is that that's not a realistic alternative, I think.
And yet, and you obviously spend a lot of time with people who are the corporate leaders, the people in business, all of whom are making this argument, and it gives a certain credibility, right, to the public who says, who are the people who are building these corporations, creating jobs? They say that this is the problem.
Well, I think that one of the things government has to do is it has to be more responsible in its own activities. I mean, you know, we do have a gigantic public debt. It gets bigger every day. 1.2 trillion this year alone, on top of all the rest. I saw an interesting statistic that if we ever got back to interest rates where they were for the 10 years prior to 2010, in 2014, the budget deficit would be $420 billion higher. So we have to get control of the budget deficit. And when you do that, you have to understand the difference between the structural budget and the cyclical budget. The structural budget is the path of spending under current law, say for Medicare or for Social Security. And the gap between the revenues and that spending is the structural deficit. The cyclical deficit is the deficit that's caused because of the financial crisis, and now unemployment is 9%, or 22 million people looking for jobs and can't find jobs. They're drawing unemployment compensation, which means drawing down, increasing the debt. They're not paying taxes, which means increasing the debt. And in some cases, that means you need to spend money there in order to get people back to work. For example, I think one of the things that this country desperately needs is a massive infrastructure program. Massive. I mean, I saw one study recently that says, you know, we can create a 1.2, over a 6-year period, if we spend $1.2 trillion on infrastructure, it would generate 5 million jobs. 5 million jobs. And people say, well, how do we have the money to do that? We're so far in debt. That's true. But if we address the big ticket items, which are defense, Social Security, Medicare, and other entitlements, if we address those and we put taxes in the equation, in other words, we get our deficit showed trending down over time, not this year or next year, because we're still in a recession and unemployment's still a problem, but 2-3 years out, then that would create some opportunity to spend money on things like infrastructure. And then, of course, we take it to the international domain, and you're the expert on this. But, you know, where have we financed our budget deficits? Our largest creditor is China. It's like $1.45 trillion that they have lent us, that they buy treasury bonds from us. If we get our deficit under control, we need less Chinese capital for the federal government's deficit. But the Chinese are still going to have a lot of dollars because they're selling exports. So we then say to the Chinese, why? We'd like you to buy our special Build America infrastructure bonds. Pretty good investment for you over a long time. And therefore, the Chinese in the 21st century become what the British were in the 19th century, which is financing the construction of infrastructure that lays the groundwork for economic growth in the United States for generations to come. So you have to be responsible about the budget deficit. Then you would have less of a problem with the charges about government. If you're totally irresponsible, you will always have problems. But let's make no mistake about it. 55% of the budget is a transfer from one group of Americans to another group of Americans. 55% of the budget. Best example of that is Medicare. 55% of the budget comes from taking from one group of Americans and giving it to the elderly, or giving it to this group or that group. Not all 55% to the elderly, but it's a big chunk of it. So unless we're prepared to deal with this realistically, and the easiest one is Social Security to deal with, Medicare is much harder, we'll never get this structural deficit under control, and we'll never be able to reclaim our birthright. You know, there's a ticking time bomb out there, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know whether it's 6 months, a year, 3 years, 2 years. At some point, if we continue to amass $1.2 trillion a year in debt on top of $5, $6, $8 trillion, somebody's not going to loan us money. And when they don't loan us money, we then have to raise interest rates. Interest rate puts it back into a recession. Unemployment skyrockets. We have a lower standard of living. So in answer to your question, yeah, government plays a central role, but government has to be responsible. And the best place that government can be responsible now is showing people how we can reduce the deficit. If you don't want any taxes, you're never going to get there. If you want only taxes, you're never going to get there. I mean, I saw one study that if you did an income tax to raise all the money you need to reduce the deficit, the top rate would be 88%, and the people who now pay 25% would be paying 63%. Not in the cards. Not in the cards. So you have to do both. You have to have some revenues, and you have to deal with the structural deficit at the same time.
So if I can, because it's too easy to not do it, is just a little bit more on the entitlement. So, and not just the substance, but you say Social Security is relatively easy, Medicare is harder. What would be the core of your approach? And also on the political vein, you're now looking at the demographics of the electorate in this country, getting older, the baby boom generation, which has been built around expectations about what's going to happen. We've seen their 401ks go down, so they don't have a lot of other safety net here, are now looking forward, and you're telling them, okay, you know, here's the safety net that you were planning on, here's what I'm going to do to it, and here's why you should still be for it, right, even though you're going to be the ones who lose.
I would say don't underestimate the patriotism of elderly Americans. In 1983, the Social Security Trust Fund was thought to be on the brink of bankruptcy. And there was a special commission, bipartisan, established I was then a first-term senator and didn't know how I was going to deal with this Social Security issue. It was thought to be the third rail. You touch it and you're dead. So what I did is I got a professor from Rutgers, and we did 12, 15 special town meetings around the country, around the state. We'd have a big blackboard. That was the days of blackboards. And he would put the numbers up there, and then we would say, okay, now we have to get this in balance. How do you all suggest we do this? And the assumption was the elderly would want it all to come from taxes and would want no cuts in benefits. And the assumption was the workers would like all cuts from the elderly, and none of them would want to have the retirement age raised. That was the assumption going in. I found that to be incorrect. I found the elderly were also parents, and they didn't want to have their children paying so much higher taxes. I found the children also were sons and daughters. They didn't want everything taken out of the elderly's benefits. And so the compromise was we did a little bit of each, and we raised the retirement age to 67 to be effective in about 4 or 5 years. That was in 1983. And so I think that it's a matter of politicians who have the courage to explain things to people and put it in a context of what's at stake, as I tried to say. If we don't get control of this, and 3 years from now, nobody shows up at the bond market, everybody's standard of living is going to go down. And this is not a gigantic, you have all the interest groups, which again is related to money, who say, if you touch anything with Social Security, you're dead in politics. By the way, send me $15 so I can build my organization, right? And what you could do to solve the whole Social Security problem, the following. If you calculated cost of living based on how people actually spend as opposed to some artificial index, if you took 1% of the Social Security tax and applied it to all income, not just the up to whatever it is, $190,000 now, if you raised the retirement age to 70 in 2057, if you did those three things, Social Security would be solid for 75 years. There would be no problem. Does anybody ever explain that to you or to you? No, because it's thought to be the third rail. So there is no excuse from actually leveling with people. My view is people want politicians to put country ahead of party and tell them the truth. And if we did that, I think we'd not only be able to solve our problems, but we'd have a much better country. Now, another story. This can be done. 2010, I think it was, Esquire magazine asked Gary Hart and me, 2 Democrats, Jack Danforth and Bob Packwood, 2 Republicans, to sit in a room in New York. We were all people who have our own convictions. We did battle each of us for 15 or 20 years. Sit in a room and come up with a balanced budget by 2022. You know something? We did it. And we did it by touching everything. We had increased taxes, largely through a gasoline tax, but at the same time we increased the gasoline tax, phased in over 10 years. We required the production of more fuel-efficient cars, 50 miles a gallon, so that in 10 years you'd be spending less on gas than you are now. We said if you're a farmer making more than $500,000, you're really not eligible for farm subsidies. We said you raise the Social Security age. We said a variety of other things on defense. We have a defense budget that reflects the realities of today as opposed to the Cold War. And we got to a budget deficit, to a balanced budget. Now, we weren't running for re-election, which is a big point. But at the same time, that offers a major opportunity. I think there is a major opportunity in this country. And the more both parties don't deal with the issues, the bigger the opportunity is. How many of you have heard of AmericansElect.org? Raise your hand. How many of you are delegates? Okay. For those of you that don't know, AmericansElect.org is the first internet nominating convention in the history of the United States. And there will begin April 15th a nominating convention. You go to the website, you register. You're a delegate. You can nominate anybody for president. There will be a series of votes. June 21st, there will be a nominee. And because of a court ruling that says Americans Elect is not a party, but a process, and therefore not subject to the campaign finance laws, enough money has been raised to get that candidate, whoever that is, on the ballot in 2012 in nearly all 50 states. Now remember the Tea Party, how quickly things change? Now, I do not think that in this election, I don't know, but I doubt that this was going to have a big impact. It's a little bit, it's appearing right now to be a little bit like Field of Dreams, remember? If you build it, they will come, except they're building it, and I'm not sure anybody's going to come. But in 2014, if there's still an impasse in Congress, you could have a third party that has four very specific objectives. Campaign finance reform, the things I was talking about, deficit reduction, very specific things. And run 50 seats, since only 45 or 50 seats are competitive anyway. You run a candidate in all of those, and in 5 Senate races, you get 30 seats and 2 Senate seats, and suddenly you're at the fulcrum of power, able to drive the process. The Congress becomes more like a parliamentary democracy. And the result is that maybe you shake things up.
So you walked right into my last question, which is, if you're nominated by Americans Elect, would you take the nomination?
No, I would not, no. No, that's not what the game is all about today.
And I won't ask you who you'd like to see as the nominee of the party. So let's go to the audience. It's your chance to, I'm pretty sure we have microphones. Yes, correct? So,
Two microphones, we'd just like to ask you when you...
okay, why don't we start right down here?
To wait for the microphone to come to you so you can be part of our record.
And if you wouldn't mind identifying yourself, just so you have a name to go with the face.
Marta Garcia Murillo, I'm faculty at the School of Information Studies. You touched 2 important issues in your talk today, and one was money and the other one was the Constitution as the solution. I am originally from Mexico, and I have always been puzzled about the sanctity of the Constitution in this country. I mean, my country has hundreds of constitutional amendments, and nobody even raised an eyebrow. And there are countries that are abolishing their entire constitutions right now and creating totally brand new ones. And the reason why I ask that is because, in addition to the money problem that you mentioned, is this notion of people having to, every 2 years, ask for more money. I mean, the short term is so, the term is so little, and the amount of time that they have to spend to be campaigning is unbelievably long and so wasteful in my opinion. So I don't understand why this constitutional amendment, which could include the shortening of the election period.
Well, the constitutional amendment would give the Congress the authority and state and local government to do what they don't have the authority to do now, according to Buckley-Villayet and Citizens United, which is to limit the amount of money. If you then had public financing, in other words, out of a $3.5 trillion budget, if you took $3 billion a year and put it in a little fund to finance Senate and House races, you'd take all these special interests out of the whole process. That's all you'd need. You need the constitutional amendment, but if you did that plus public financing, that solves the problem. Pardon? Sanctity of the Constitution. Well, it is our fundamental law, and I don't think that following the recipe of other countries having new constitutions every decade is probably advisable. Let me argue that it's not the Constitution per se, but the people who interpret the Constitution that are the problem. I mean, let me just give you an example. I did this earlier in one of the classes. I personally think that the best Supreme Court justices are politicians and law professors. I do not think the best Supreme Court justices are people with fixed views who become little judges, then big judges, then bigger judges, and try to tell us what the founders were thinking 200 years ago today about the internet. Right? I just don't think that that's a recipe. And I would ask you to consider 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education, right? That was the law that desegregated desegregated schools in America. Desegregated schools in America. The Supreme Court that had a unanimous decision to desegregate schools in America had 4 politicians on it. The Chief Justice was a former governor of California, Earl Warren, and 3 senators, former senators, Menton, Black, and forget the other guy's name, begins with M. And they were on the, and I think that they were able, therefore, to give the court a reflection of what it meant in society as a whole. They weren't there trying to score points and sophist points on the founders' intentions. They dealt with the world as we had and saw it at the time. So I don't think the problem is the Constitution. I think it's those who interpret the Constitution. And you always have a chance to change, as this example shows, through amendment.
Okay, Russ.
Hi, Bill.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
You a Knick fan?
I am a Knick fan.
Okay. You like Bruce?
I'm from New Jersey, so I have to like Bruce. I had a question for you about the adjustment from becoming a NBA player to a politician. What were some of the biggest challenges that you faced from becoming a player in the NBA to becoming a politician? And also on the more humorous side, was it more difficult for you to average over 10 points a game for 8 straight years or become a United States Senator?
What was your first question?
Ignore the second one, but the first one was what were some of the biggest challenges for you from becoming
Well, you know, one of the things that you think about, there's similarity between being a professional athlete in America in the 1970s and being a U.S. Senator in the 1980s. Every day you have to meet the press. It is a public profession. And there's a difference, though. I mean, you know, when you're a basketball player, you have to wake up every morning and crawl on your knees to soak in a tub in order to walk, right? As a politician, the pressure is constant. And I remember I was in the Senate cloakroom one night, and I was watching one guy who was talking, another guy telling a joke, another guy writing something, another guy smoking, and I thought, this is not a lot different than the Knick locker room. And that realization kind of calmed me and allowed me to say, I can adjust to this. So, you know, obviously there are gigantic differences. One's entertainment and one's life and death. But there were these commonalities that helped me make that transition. On your second point, I think being elected to the Senate was probably a harder job than averaging over 10 points a game. Well, people say, you know, what was your biggest thrill? NBA championship twice or Senate election 3 times? And I say, well, my biggest honor was being elected to the Senate 3 times. But all that did was give me the opportunity to work 16 hours a day for 6 years to prove the people were not wrong. But when you win the NBA championship, you know, your fists are in the air, your smile, your face aches, and your chills are going up and down the spine. You realize you're the best in the world for that year. That's the biggest thrill.
Thank you.
Not sure I can see where the mics are.
Hello? Here's one.
Do I go?
Yeah, go ahead. I can't see the
I
mic,
can
so
hear
don't
you,
know.
so,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay, yeah, please.
You speak about the need for a constitutional amendment. Is there any attempt being made to organize that at this time?
No.
Shouldn't there be?
Yes, I personally think so. I'm saying this in this new book, right? I actually said it in the book I wrote in 1996, and I took all kinds of holy hell from all the free speech people. And I retreated to just public finance. But I don't think that's enough now. I think you need the constitutional amendment. And yes, it begins by this room. It's not a complicated subject. It begins by this room figuring out how you do that. Yes.
Hello, I'm a Japanese Maxwell student. I'm from Politicians World. I have a question about decision making and vision. Today, many of the Maxwell lecture speakers reads paper smoothly and using PowerPoint. They're showing evidences, but you didn't use it. You're watching people. You watch the people's response. You are a tall basketball player. Your eye positions are very high. And internet, Wikipedia said that your visual is very much wider than any other human beings. Yeah, so, yeah. So when you're making decisions, are you trying to overview whole the situation, grab it from higher position with a wide vision? Or you are trying to focus more specific point, or to try to focus one point, like a basketball free throw? Which way are you using it?
Okay, I appreciate the analogy, but let me take it from there and say, I think that, I mean, I had some skills, but I clearly wasn't the greatest player. But I had great eyes. I mean, I could see my fingers, right? And I had the ability to see the whole court. And I think that's what you need in politics. You need to be able to see the whole court, which means how this guy's related to that guy, and if this one moves, that doesn't move, and this can happen, and that can happen, as opposed to think it's all deficit reduction. That's part of it, but that's not the only part of it. So you have to see the whole court. You have to be specific, but you have to be flexible enough to create. And if you do that, you succeed in basketball, and I think that that's the best kind of politician. If you often find this with certain politicians. They know one song and they sing it over and over and over and over. If you ask them another question, they look like deers with a head in the headlights, i.e., what was his name? Senator who was Bush's quail. What? I wasn't quite prepared for that question. So you have to see the whole court.
Okay, we're going to take one more, and I think there's a mic up there.
I'll take a couple more.
Okay, you're right?
Yeah.
All right, okay.
I'm having fun.
Go ahead.
Hi, Senator Bradley. I'm Davis Hull. I'm a student over at Whitman getting my MBA. I had two questions. Well, first of all was, we have a lot of right now, I think, a lot like the partisan fighting. I think the perfect example is what happened, I think the recent resignation, from Senator Olympia Snowe in Maine, because we can't really get anything done. So how do you think we can really solve that in the next couple of years? And number two, what is the effect you think it's having as far as on the next generation of people my age that want to get into politics? So for example, people in 1960, with the election of Kennedy v. Nixon, you had people that grew up and said, I want to work in the government, I want to grow up and be president. So now people are saying they want to work on Wall Street, they want to work in corporations, and not necessarily everybody wants to grow up and want to be president of the United States. I think we can solve that.
Okay. I think that on your last question, the only way that we're going to create a collegial politics is if we have elected officials who understand what the stakes are and understand that in a process that requires compromise, you can't compromise unless you know your colleague and unless you're willing to modify your position. how do we make that happen? What's the catalyst? I mean, there are times in American history when there were two irreconcilable views that were the civil right time right before the Civil War comes to mind. But usually what happens is there's partisan battle and one side ultimately wins decisively. It's not pretty, but it happens. Or you find some enlightened individuals, and I still had hope for some Republicans in the lame duck session here to come over and do what's in the country's interest. Absent those two things, you then have a third force, a third party. And that's the opportunity for the Congressional Party if you have this continued paralysis, in my opinion. What was your first question? Was that it?
Okay, but his question was about young people aspiring to be president. The fact that this is no longer kind of every young
Well, you know, I don't know
American's-
how you felt, but when Barack Obama came out in Chicago that night to accept the nomination of to accept the election as President of the United States, I had tears in my eyes. I'm sure you did too. I'm sure a lot of people in this room did. It showed, you know, it made a statement about the country, that things were really open, that all the work that's been done on race for the past 40 years actually has improved things. But it wasn't just about race that was the key to Obama's and how you felt. It was that he touched the hearts of young people by convincing them that they could make a difference in the life of their country. That was what was so inspiring, ultimately. And so I think that it hasn't been long since we had that. It's been less than 4 years. And I think a lot of young people might have made the mistake of believing that he could do it all alone. But no president could do it all alone, not even someone who touched our hearts as deeply as Barack Obama, because it takes citizens. You can have a leader that has clarity and he can lay out and inspire, but you need sergeants and lieutenants who are going to be operational and make it happen. And I think maybe too many people thought it was over with the election night when it was just really beginning. It's like being elected to the Senate and having to work 16 hours a day.
Hi, I'm Bo Stewart, and I'm a freshman political science and policy studies major. My question is, what do you think of Paul Ryan's attempts to address entitlement spending in the country?
I think they're serious. I give him credit for being specific, and I think that there ought to be a serious negotiation with everything on the table, including his proposals. I don't agree with his proposals, but they should be on the table. And it should be where his proposals on Medicare, Obama's proposals on Medicare, or a House counterpart. There should be taxes, there should be defense, there should be Social Security. If you don't have those four, you're simply not going to be able to get it done. I saw one thing that said defense, entitlements, and interest on the debt by 2014 will be 76% of the budget. So you're not going to get the deficit down unless you deal with those issues. And I think he's made a contribution by putting forward something specific. He's taken all kinds of flack for it. He's going to be one of the subjects of the Democratic campaign this year, saying, you know, Republicans will do this because he put it out there. But I think he has moved the debate forward. Last question.
Okay, right here.
Yes. I'm definitely Louis Charles. I'm Haitian. And I want to say thank you, Bill, for being here with us. And I will charge you a specific mission. Thanks God, the US become the one of the rich country. Thanks God. When you understand the context of moving yourself from colonialism.
Thank you.
France and Haiti make the same experience, but you do best and the first, and we assist that the U.S. money, like a capitalist country, have few families or manage this money. My question and my proposal, how come you help to adjust a safety valve in the capitalist system using the Congress in your influence and also your charisma to let people understand that the struggle against the banking is not completely okay? Because like Madison said, we have to protect the faction. We have to. Because everybody have the right to exist, to have, and discuss what they believe in the name of a democracy by the people and for the people. Now, let's go back to the for the people.
Quick question.
Quick question, yes. How come you put your influence to move all this money from those people and redistribute this money now, invest and encourage people who are slaves from the barriers, because we got barriers here who stop you to be a big businessman too. So we have to stop that and redistribute the money. Then we can have a healthy society again to say a government by the people and for the people.
Okay. Well, I appreciate what you said. Thank you very much for your kind thoughts and your compliment. In answer to your question, I think that the issue is not taking from rich and giving to poor. I think the issue is assuring poor have the resources to advance themselves. And I think you begin with prenatal care, and you begin with infant care, and you begin with nutrition, and you begin with early childhood schools. You begin with great public schools wherever you live. That's where you begin, so that everybody has a chance to make a maximum contribution to the country, as opposed to have to deal with whatever problems they have because they haven't been given the opportunity to make a maximum contribution to the country. And I think if we had those things, and that's not a matter, the issue of where the money comes from, I think everybody should pay. Do I think the people who have more should pay more? Yeah, that's a fundamental principle of the right tax system. Do I think in the current circumstance some people should pay more? Yes, I do. But that's not the answer. It's a much bigger problem than that. And you have to be able to get a foundation of what is needed to make a, let me give you another example. You know, we've been very hit, our economy's been really hit hard in the manufacturing sector in the last 2 decades. In the last 10 years, 40,000 factories in the United States closed, 6 million jobs. And if you did the supply chain, it's even more. But manufacturing is not dead. It's actually making a comeback. But in order for it to really make a comeback, it's higher skills. So people have to be re-educated. They have to have opportunities to do that. You do that at community colleges. But if you're a single mother and you have 2 kids, you can't do that. Because who's going to take care of the kids? So if you simply put at community colleges a child care center, you would have the single mother who now has 3 major burdens. You know, support the kids, get a job, get re-educated to get a better job. Would then not have 3, and she could become a contributing member to our society. So you have to figure out how you get people in the game, not how you take from one group and give to another group. That thinking is part of the problem now. And for example, I always say, yeah, the wealthy should pay more, but it should be not so the poor can have some, but it should be because that's their citizenship responsibility. Everybody has something to do. The wealthy should pay more, right? But the wealthy should also, you know, teach their kids between right and wrong. And everybody else should too. And people say education, yeah, teachers are the most important. No, 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 parents are the most important. At the same time, you need good teachers, and you got to pay teachers. I mean, there are 3,168,000 public school teachers in America. They're the future. If we're going to move into the 21st century and compete effectively, we got to have the best teachers in the classrooms. We're not getting the best teachers in the classroom now. And we're not equipping them with what we need to have. So if you begin to do things that build the foundation, then you launch everybody into contributing members of society.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming.